He has put together perhaps the best and most comprehensive handout of any speaker we've had very
The only one.
So Manny has got a handout here, but Manny is one of our members, lives in North Oaks, and I've known him in fact, I was president of the Sales and Marketing Executives in Minneapolis in 1981-82, and we had Manny as our speaker at the December, I believe it was the December meeting, and that was a long time ago. So we've maintained that friendship. He does a very good job. He's the expert, the international expert on listening. He's authored a book, which you'll probably talk about, and he is a man that we should all listen to. So Manny, thank you for coming and sharing your wisdom on listening.
Thank you, Don. Thank you very much. Good job.
Listen up. People don't have share with us.
You know, we prepare for those kinds of events, and here are some extras. And by the way, let me just invite you not to get too far ahead of me in the handout, because I may not go where I thought I was going to go. So just flow with me, if you would. When we get there, it'll make a whole lot more sense to you. I have to say it's a pleasure to come here and speak to the Optimist Group. For the last 54 years, I've had the privilege and pleasure of wandering around the world talking to all kinds of organizations, 25 countries, every kind of organization, military group, churches, and so forth. And in that process, I have to tell you that there were times that I found myself speaking to pessimists. So it's a pleasure to be here, speaking to optimists. As my son Scott here told me, he said, Dad, he said, you can't go wrong today. He said, even if you suck, he said, they'll be positive. And you have to know my son Scott to appreciate that. My grandson Ben, my son-in-law Sam back there, my friend Betsy Buckley, a number of people who are here, and I'm glad that you're here. We live in perilous times. We live in a day and an age where listening is probably more important than ever before. 1926, Dr. Paul Rankin asked a very simple question. He asked the question, he said, how do you spend your day? And he got a group of people, and he did a research project, and he basically discovered in 1926, times were different than they are today, he discovered that people spent 7 out of every 10 minutes, 70% of their time communicating while awake with other people. He didn't measure how well, he didn't measure how poorly. He simply ran the clock. How do you spend your time? 1926, he discovered this. 70% of the waking hours people reported, they communicated with other people in some form or fashion for some purpose or another, etc. But then he broke it down further. He asked the question, how does that communication time break out? And he took the 4 basics that we still utilize today. He basically broke it down, asked the people, how much time do you spend of your communication time reading, writing, speaking, or listening? And on average, he discovered this. Based on the results, people said that they spent 9% on average of their waking communication time engaged in the activity of writing. 16% on average engaged in the activity of reading. 30% on average of the total communication time spent engaged in the activity of speaking. And 45% spent on listening. Didn't talk about how well, just how much. 1929 came back, ran the study again, found the same basic results. From 1926 to 29 through the years to the present day, that research has been replicated by a variety of different kinds of people. And Bob, you know very well, the number one activity of people, we still are primarily communicating beings, and the number one activity is listening. Now, if you think about your own day in, day out, day after day, you can do this little test for yourself. Just divide your day into communication, 4 slots, reading, writing, speaking, listening, and every few 10, 15 minutes, ask yourself, how much time did I spend reading, writing, speaking, or listening? Now, of course, we live in a different time with the technology. There's a constant flow of communication. Think about it. Everybody here in this room is connected to the world out there if you have a smartphone, iPhone, etc. The communication is coming at us more and faster than ever before. But the fact of the matter is, listening remains in some form or fashion. Listening remains the predominant thing we do. And so today what I like to do is to explore a little bit of that with you. To talk a little bit about how much do you listen, who do you listen to, how well do you listen, how can you be better, what do you listen for, why do you listen, what are the different purposes of listening, and so forth. Don called me. Don, where are you at? Don called me the other day and he said, we're going to have a good crowd today. He said, what are you doing? I said, what do you mean, what am I doing? He said, what are you doing right now? I said, well, I'm putting together a handout. He said, a handout? And he was incredulous. He said, a handout? I said, I'm putting together a handout. He said, a handout? I said, yeah, a handout, Don. He said, a handout? He said, I don't think anybody ever that's spoken has ever given a handout. They've had slides, they've had all that. And by the way, when he says, thank you, Don, for the nice comment, if no one's ever had handouts before.
I gotta correct that. Bob,
Bob, did you have a handout? But he said, a handout? He said, no. At any rate, my point to him was simply this. You know, we're going to tell you today to take some notes. Because we know listeners who take notes listen better than listeners who don't take notes, generally speaking. I've already taken a bunch of notes for you, so we have a way that you can. I told you not to go ahead, Ted. Slow down. See, some people don't listen well when you give them instructions.
It's the answers.
So the answer in the handout depends upon what you put with your own words, your own purpose, your own intent, your own world, in addition to what we're going to talk about today. So let me simply do this. If we take a look at the objectives of a presentation, my objectives are real simple. And that is that, very simply put, how do we enhance your attitudes, how do we develop some skills, and how do we raise knowledge? And if you think about that, attitude, skills, and knowledge, if you turn the page, what you'll see eventually here is the fact that it all relates to things that we can do. We'll come back to attitude, skills, and knowledge about listening, because what we found is that the great listeners, truly the great listeners, you and people that you know, have the proper attitude, they have enhanced skills, and of course, they have established deeper knowledge about the task at hand. So what I like to do very simply is to start you out with an invitation. And the invitation simply goes something like this. Today, in the next matter of minutes, while we're here together, I invite you to assume the predominant responsibility for our communication success. I assume it from my end. I invite you to assume it from your end. I'm open and willing. If you don't hear what I'm saying and want me to say it again, just let me know. If you don't understand what I'm talking about and want me to explain it a little different way, just let me know. If you have a strong disagreement and want to have a discussion about it, just let me know. The fact of the matter is, I invite you to assume the predominant responsibility for our success today. And as optimists, I know that you will, because that is the orientation that you come from. Secondly, we have a little tool that I developed 50-some years ago called VM of L. VM of L very simply stands for Value Moment of Listening. And here's what I invite you to do. You see, the value moment of listening resides with you, the listener. The speakers have values from their perspective, but ultimately, the real values of listening for you reside within you. So here's my invitation. Today, our time together, find one thing of value to you. One thing that you can take out, profit from, and utilize. That'd be beneficial to you. Your value moment of listening. And by the way, if you find one, look for a second one. And if you find two, look for a third. And if by the time we're done today you find 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a handful of value moments of listening that will enrich your optimist life, we're ahead of the game. And here's what I've discovered over the years. Your value of moment of listening may be different from what I intended. Isn't that interesting? Sometimes someone will say, you know, my value moment of listening was X, Y, Z, and I'm thinking, I never even talked about that, which is the beauty. VM of L, search, seek, find your value of moment of listening in our time today. Plan to report. Who's not here today? Who in your life is important, who's significant, whether it be in your work life, your family life, or your social life? Who are the individuals out there who aren't here that will profit by your sharing your value moments with them at a later time? In a sense, it's kind of simple. But I'll tell you what, most of us don't do a very good job of it. We go and we listen and we speak and we're on the phone and we go to church and we're in meetings and the speakers go on and on and on. We're in the classroom, wherever, and we haven't sat back and said, I am going to assume the predominant responsibility. I'm going to find the best listening seat in the house. I'm going to control distractions. I'm going to take notes, all the stuff that you see there, and I'm going to plan to report to a specific person. You and I and we listen better. Research is crystal clear. We listen better when we listen on purpose, when we listen with intent, and when we listen to share what we have listened to and learned and profited from with other important people in our life. Not very complicated. Pretty simple when you really get right down to it. When I was 17 years old, I joined the United States Navy. I was mature enough at 17 years old, coming out of Albert Lea, Minnesota, to realize I was not mature enough to go to college or the university. Any of you fall into that camp? Back then, of course, we had a draft. You didn't have a choice. You either went now or you went later, unless you had some disabilities or whatever. I joined the Navy. They trained me as an electrician because they said I had those kinds of competencies that measured up to their needs. One day, a young fellow next to me said, you know, I heard a guy tell us that if we want to go over and see a head shrinker and take a physical, we could go play basketball in the afternoon. Well, I listened to that. So I said, well, that sounds good. 17 years old, 18 years old sometimes, right, Ben? You listen, you say, yeah, that makes sense. So took the physical exams, sat down with a psychiatrist and asked a bunch of questions and wrote a bunch of stuff down. And then my friend other sailor. We went and we played basketball in the afternoon. Didn't think much about it. Time went on. When got out of boot camp and all of that, you had a choice as to where you were going to go. I went to a school and a school, and as a consequence, one day I had a choice. Where do I want to go in the Navy? I was 18 years old, you know. Oh, I had an aircraft carrier out of California that I had identified. I was number 1, 2 in my class. I had the first choice. And when I started to say I want to go to the aircraft carrier out there, they said, no, 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 no. You're going to submarine school. I said, submarine school? Never thought about submarine school. Never really thought much about submarines. They're kind of hidden. They're underwater, you know. As a consequence, I end up going to submarine school. Because at that time, you went where they told you to go. I remember going home and my parents and friends said, where are you going next? I said, I'm going to submarine school, New London, Connecticut. And I can remember crossing the Thames River out in New London, going up to Groton, or Groton going up to New London, and thinking, where the heck am I going? Well, I'm going where they're telling me to go. And I learned a significant listening moment, a listening lesson in that whole episode. Because one thing you had to do is you had to qualify through submarine school to go on to a submarine. And by the way, this is back in the days when they were called pig boats. Those were the old diesel boats. Those are the old World War II boats. Okay? 28 feet wide, 301 feet long, 100 people put together. Great food, by the way. Great food. Great food. But it was a stinky environment. But to get there, you had to pass a test. So picture this now, if you will. 100-foot water tower filled with water. And on the very bottom, picture a little space about the size of an elevator. Dry, 6 people, with a hatch. And my first real listening lesson began many years before that because I had good parents and good teachers and good friends and people who focused on the importance of listening and so forth. Good coaches, all the people that were positive, church people, etc., they taught great listening lessons. But that day I learned a very interesting lesson. 6 of us in this dry little compartment with a hatch. On the other side of that hatch, 100 feet of water. 100 feet down, the pressure is 64 pounds per square inch. And all of a sudden, the guy said, hitting each of us on the chest, listen or you'll die. That gets your attention. Listen or you'll die. And I figured out real quickly the opposite of that is if you listen real well, you won't die. All of a sudden the water started coming in over our feet, over our ankles, over our knees. If you had claustrophobia, this was a problem. I've got it today, but I didn't have it then. Interesting thing, all of a sudden it's to your waist, all of a sudden it's to your chest, and all of a sudden it's right about here. And you have about this much air left above. And at that time, the hatch can be opened and no more water will come in. But here's what they said one more time. Listen or you'll die. When you're into the main water tube, blow all the air out of your lungs. Now you want to talk about optimism? You want to talk about trust? You want to talk about listening and thinking that they know more than you know? And the question was, when you're there, before you move up, blow all the air out of your lungs. And here's what's interesting, and this is why they tell you, listen or you'll die, because if you don't do this, you'll die. Because at 50 feet up, it's only 32 pounds per square inch pressing your lungs, and your lungs expand. And if you don't keep blowing all the air out of your lungs, they explode and you die. And by the way, every year, and every year since then, every year to this point in time, there are young sailors who are qualifying for submarine school who die. Not listening and not understanding and not acting appropriately based on what someone who knows more than you know, there are people who die. Well, luckily, you hit the surface, by the way, in about 10 seconds, you know, and then you pass all the other tests. Then you go on a submarine, and then you float around the ocean for a few years, tracking things and all that, which was a fascinating experience. And by the time I came out of the Navy, I was ready to go to school. Came back, went to the University of Minnesota. I was going into business because that's where my father was, management and so forth. And somebody told me along the way, you know, the key to business, the key to management is communication. It's at the heart of business and management, communication. And so I took a bunch of those courses. And then somebody said, you know, the key is psychology. So I took a bunch of those courses. And before I knew it, I had a double major and a minor in communication, speech communication, and business, and some psychology. And then, this is where it gets interesting. Where did your life turn? Where was the change in your life that you were going down a pathway and somebody told you something and it was diverted? Either for the bad or for the good, but let's say for the good because we're optimists, okay? Somebody said to me one day, "What's your rainy day ticket?" I listened to that. I said, "Huh? What's your rainy day ticket?" I listened real carefully. Again, I said, "Huh?" He said, "Rainy day ticket." I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "No matter where you're at, whatever you study, whatever you know, whatever you're at," he said, "What's your rainy day ticket? Something you can fall back on if you need to. What will the world always need?" And he went through a list. The world will always need accountants. The world will always need lawyers. The world will always need teachers. The world will always need da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. I never viewed myself as a teacher. But I thought, education, because that's what he suggested. I said, "What do you have to do for that?" I listened. As a consequence, he said, "Well, you have to go over and take education 55A and 55B, and you have to go student teach 2 quarters, and then you'll be certified to teach, and it's a good rainy day ticket." He did that. And it was fun. And then I graduated, and I thought, well, no, I'm going into business. I'm going into management. I'm going into that world, not into the teaching world. But I was ready to go into the teaching world if I needed a rainy day ticket. See, you all can add the same stories to this story because we all have, very few have gone straight line, right? Somewhere we have listened to someone and we did something and we ended up over here. And I interviewed for a company downtown Minneapolis, and a wonderful guy who was the hiring guy who turned out to have 10 kids. And he hired me. We had a starting date, we had a starting salary. It was a management trainee job. Back in those days, they were a dime a dozen. And he said, "Let's go to lunch." Went over to the Minneapolis Athletic Club, and he said to me, "By the way, I've been looking at your resume, your academic, your Vita," and so he said, what's this teaching certificate and all that?" I said, "That's just a rainy day ticket." You know, when you're young, you say things that make sense to you. I said, "That's just a rainy day ticket." He said, "What do you mean a rainy day ticket?" I said, "Well, you know, if things don't work out, something to always fall back on." And he said, "Did you enjoy teaching?" I said, "Yeah." Student taught, it was fun, it was good. It was a feeling that you were helping other people. And he said, "Why don't you go look for a teaching job now. And if you come back within a year, the job will be here and we'll give you a raise. I hadn't worked a day. But I listened. I was married, I went out and ended up finding a teaching job down in Illinois. Went down as the director of debate and forensics down there and had a great year. At the end of the year, they fired my boss. And they asked me if I wanted to be chair of the department. And I said, why did you fire my boss? By the way, that's a good question for you to ever ask if you're in that position. And they said, the superintendent said, he was too bushy-tailed. Now here's a lesson of listening. I said, what does that mean? He said he had too many ideas. He wanted to do this, 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 and this, and this. He said he was too bushy-tailed. I said, well, if you didn't like him, you're not going to like me. Because 80% of those ideas were mine. And my wife and I packed up those few belongings we had, the piano, we came back because I had a job in Minneapolis with a raise, never worked a day. Came back, knocks on Frank Madden's door and said, Frank, I'm back. He said, glad you're here. He said, job is here, here's the starting date, here's the new salary, blah, blah, blah. And we went over to the Minneapolis Club, the land of Betsy Buckley. Right, Betsy? And we had lunch. And he said, what are you going to do about your master's degree? I said, someday I'd like to work on that. And he said, why don't you go do it now? He said, you go do it now? He said, we'll hold this job open. You get a master's degree, you come back, we'll give you another raise. And here was a turning point in my life. So I went to the University of Minnesota. I knocked on the door of Dr. Ralph Nichols. You know him well, right, Bob?
I do.
Father, I gave him a title later on, the father of the field of listening. He started his work doing research in 1940s. And by the way, the University of Minnesota, St. Paul campus, Department of Rhetoric, was the center of listening in this country. I want to work on a master's degree. When I was in Illinois teaching, 3 of us, team teaching. If you were in 10th grade, you got the 3 of us. Tom was the theater guy, I was the debate guy, Dave was the general guy. And when we divided all the subjects up on the wall to teach those 10th graders, the last word up there was listening. And Dave and Tom looked at me and they said, Steil, you can teach that. I said, why me? They said, well, because you're from Minnesota. Which made sense to me because I stayed one day ahead of the kids reading Ralph Nichols' book of Are You Listening, etc. But when I came back, Nichols, Ralph Nichols. The last book we wrote, he wrote a wonderful acknowledgement when he was 97 years old, and it makes more sense than things that most of us could write. Nick was the giant. I studied with him. I was there for a year. I got a call from McAllister to come and teach there and take over Roger Mosvik's debate and forensic program, which they were giants over there. I was there 6 years. But I learned some lessons of listening along the way, and that's what I want to share with you today. I hadn't finished my master's. I was too busy going on debate trips and that kind of thing, too busy consulting and speaking elsewhere. And all of a sudden, after 3 years I was there, I hadn't quite finished my master's yet. And the provost, Lucius Garvin, called me one day and he said, would you come over to my office and chat? I went over to his office and listened. He said, he didn't say, when are you going to finish your master's degree? He basically said very simply, have you thought about a PhD? Well, I had thought about a PhD because 95% of the people at McAllister had PhDs. I had thought about a PhD. And I said, well, I have a problem. Slight one, but it's a problem. I have a son who's 2 years old. My wife's pregnant with another child. And I can't take any more classes at Minnesota enough to get a PhD. So I have to go someplace. He said, well, that's why we called you here. He said, we'll offer you a full year leave of absence with full pay to go someplace and work on a PhD. Now, I don't know about you when you've ever had moments where you made decisions in 7 nanoseconds with the addition that, well, I need to check with the other half and so forth. A turning point. Went to Wayne State University in Michigan. All the giants were there. 3 of the big giants in the field were there. Studied with them. And listening had captured my attention. From the day that someone said, die or you'll listen or you'll die, rather. Listen or you'll die. I was just seeing if you were listening. To that day, and came back, and then Nick called me and said, come on back over to the university, and I was there another, 14 years or whatever, and had the privilege, and a blessing and a privilege, of working with the genius in the field of listening. And as a consequence, as Bob can tell you, if you're on the faculty and you're teaching, the phone rings, people want to have you come and speak and so forth. In 1979, I founded the International Listening Association, 40 years ago. It's still going on. And by the way, if any of you know anyone who's dealing out there, whether it be in education or business or the clergy or whatever, who wants to focus on listening, have them look up the International Listening Association. We just had our 40th convention in Vancouver this past year. Next year we'll be in Seattle, etc. So let's go back to attitude, skills, and knowledge. And notice attitude, skill, and knowledge. If you look at the little handout, you'll see A is in the lower left-hand corner, K is in the lower right-hand corner, and S is in the top. It's what I call the ASK model, attitude, skills, and knowledge. But it's the attitude and it's the knowledge that provides the foundation plate upon which we build skills. You can work at building skills all you want, but if you don't have the right attitude, it makes no difference. You get all the skills in the world, but if you don't really have much knowledge about the challenges of listening, the process of listening, the purposes of listening, and so forth. Attitude, skills, and knowledge. And so one of the things that we ultimately move to is this simple question: whom do you listen to? In your work world, in your family world, your social world, who are the people out there that you listen to? There's 7 billion people out there. Who do you listen to? Who are the 25 most significant people that you listen to day in, day out, day after day? In your family life, in your social life, in your work life? Who are they? And even though they call me the ambassador of listening, I have to tell you, I'm of the opinion you and I, we can't listen to everybody out there. There's 7 billion of them out there. Who are the 25? Who's number 1? Who's number 2? Who's number 3? There's a little worksheet. Don't fill it out now, but take it back to your office or work, wherever, home, and fill it out. By the way, who should you increase your listening to? Who should you decrease your listening to? And trust me, there are people that you and I ought to add to our list, increase, listen better, further, deeper. But there are some people that we should decrease our listening to. They're negative. They don't have a positive point of view. They're not optimistic. They're not realists, etc. They're filling our ear with things that don't do us any good. Who should you add to your list? And who should you drop? And then I ask the next question. Turn the page. How well do you listen? How well do you listen? We've been measuring listeners for decades. And we can score listeners. But my starting point always is to ask myself first and other people second, how well do you listen? Who do you listen to? How well do you listen? By the way, if you're listening to the same thing over and over and over and over, where it is so predictable, you know what they're going to say before they say it, think about listening to the other side. Think about listening to the other side. By the way, you may not like what the other side says, maybe contrary to what you feel or believe or whatever, but if you don't know what the other side is saying, if you don't listen to them, how will you ever know whether what they're saying is fact or opinion or well-reasoned or not, and so forth? So I ask a very simple question, how well do you listen? And here's a simple way. It's right there in front of you. Rank yourself in an overall. This is a general overall. It'll vary from person to person that you listen to, but are you superior? Are you excellent? Are you above average, average, below average, poor, or lousy? Pick a spot. How would you rate yourself? And then let's do it on a numerical basis, on a scale of 100 to 0 or 0 to 100, 100 high. How well do you listen? Pick a score. And if you could and would, describe yourself overall as a listener with 3 words, what would they be? Now, by the way, Don, the optimists, those words ought to be optimistic in essence. But beyond that, how would you describe yourself if limited to 3 words? Remember, we're talking about attitude, skills, and knowledge. This is the knowledge part, in a sense, to say, where am I in the world of listening? And then if you want to do something really interesting, go out to those significant others that you've identified as people to whom you listen and ask them to rate and score and describe you as a listener. Now, I know it varies depending upon circumstance, situation, topics, events, and so forth. But other people have a viewpoint of me, you, the people around you. And the big question in my mind always is, how does that correlate with how I see myself? If other people are telling me that they would rate, evaluate, describe me differently than I rate myself or describe myself, the bells ought to ring, I think, to say, is there something I need to do here attitudinally? Is there something I need to build knowledge on? And do I need to refine and advance my skills? Because the bottom line, it all comes down to, how do I see myself? But how do other people that are important in my life see me? I know that in my life there are people who see me more as a talker than a listener. I know that because that's part of my career. Okay? I have things to share. I know that sometimes I talk too much. But when we really get down to the nub, what I want to know is, how well do I listen to other people and what do they say about that? And then, of course, you can project this onto other people. What does your best friend say? What does your boss say? What does your colleague? What does your subordinate? What is your customer? And we put all this in the plural, one by one by one. What about your spouse? How about your kids? How about the people in your world? How do they see and rate and describe you as a listener? And I'll guarantee you one thing today, because I've seen it happen over and over and over across the lands. The people who take on this little exercise profit. They become better because all of a sudden they're focused on attitude, skills, and knowledge. And once you do that, what do you think we find? We find that all of a sudden we have something to work on. There's a little thing I call the Steil listening law. It simply is the word law. L equals A times times L equals A times W squared. L is listening. A is ability times willingness squared. Somebody asked me one day why I squared that listening law. And I said very simply, Einstein squared his, so why wouldn't I square mine? And the fact is, you can have all the ability in the world, but if you're not willing, it doesn't make much difference. You can be willing to listen to the world's end, but if you don't have the ability, it doesn't make any difference. We need to combine both our ability as a listener, our abilities as a listener, and our willingness as a listener. I pose a question to you today. Okay, this is the Optimist Club, not the Pessimist Club. Who are the people that you're not willing to listen to? Who know things that you would benefit from? What are the abilities that you don't have to serve you and the other people that you're listening to? The listening law puts a spotlight on this. And if you really work through this, here's what I know. I've seen it happen over and over. People's ability increases and their willingness changes. Changes over a period of time in their willingness to listen to people that they were not willing to listen to before. We know that there are a lot of costs of poor listening. You see some of them laid out there, whether it be in the family world, whether it be in the work world, whether it be in the social world. I'm told that 50% of all divorces occur because of some failure of listening. We see families out there where there's no father, no mother in the house, whatever, either way. We see kids who are adrift because no one's listening to them. The simple fact in my mind is when we take a look at the cost of poor listening, we can measure it. We lose time. The only thing that's not replaceable, by the way, time. When I don't listen well and I have to listen again and again and again, or someone else doesn't listen well and has to be told again and again and again, time is out the window, never to be replaced. We lose money. I could do nothing but tell you stories today about the money lost because people haven't listened. And it happens every day at every turn in every quarter. We know that sales are lost. We know that relationships suffer. We know that opportunities are missed. We know that lawsuits fail. Matt Kanan here with Lexus could tell you stories about sales that were lost over at Lexus because people didn't listen, on either side perhaps. Ted Risdall could tell you all kinds of stories in the marketing world about where costs were paid. Every one of us in this room could tell stories about the costs of poor listening. And I give you an opportunity and an invitation on the right-hand side of page 7 at your leisure. Don't get distracted right now, but at your leisure to sit down and record some costs of because of poor listening that you have engaged, experienced, observed, whatever you want to say, and you will be flabbergasted. The costs are absolutely extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary. We just suffered massacres in this country, people shooting people. Somewhere, I'll guarantee you, in those stories, there were people who were not listened to, clues that were out there with a flag waving that were not listened to, and so forth. The question is, how do we move the costs to the profits? How do we build, save time, make money, enhance sales? How do we build relationships? How do we do all of those? By simply focusing on and enhancing our attitude, our skills, and our knowledge about listening. And then, and here's the key, activating into positive, productive behaviors. We take a look at purposes of communication. Next page, page 9, I guess. The pages are not totally in order because I've taken some stuff out of here, but because of time limitations. But we've discovered that there are only 5 reasons why people communicate. And we've also learned in those 5 reasons why we communicate that we need to be aware and adapt our listening accordingly. I talk about 4 here. Purposes. And again, whether it's in the family, whether it's in the social world or the work world. And here are the purposes. Notice it's built like a house. It's a pyramid. There's a foundation plate. It's an ascending order. And the really outstanding listeners that we've worked with and observed and measured, they understand the sender's purpose and their purpose in terms, and then adapt their listening accordingly. Phatic communication is simply the chit-chat or small talk of life. It's where we talk about the weather, the weekend, the ball game, the new outfit, the latest trip, all of those things. It's chit-chat, it's phatic. And there are some people, because of their personality, they say, waste of time, not going to do that. I don't have time for the chit-chat or small talk. But here's what I can tell you about listening. The people who engage in the phatic communication build relationships. If you want to think about one word, think about the word binding. They build binding relationships, and people who are bound together listen better to each other at higher levels than those who are not bound together. So I invite you to take a look at your attitude, your skills, and your knowledge. What's your attitude towards listening to the chit-chat and small talk? How often do you say, I don't have time for that, I'm too busy, I got too much stuff going on, I like to listen to you, but and as a consequence, we never get bound together. I want to repeat it. The phatic chit-chat is the foundation plate. It doesn't call for a lot of judgment, it just calls for careful listening and connecting, getting bound up together. You see, last night I was at a moment of dinner, and I saw Ted Risdall and his wife and his son Max. Yesterday, by the way, was Ted Risdall's 26th wedding anniversary. Do that. Yeah. And by the way, the interesting thing is, if you sit down and have a little bit, just a little bit of phatic chit-chat, small talk, you learn things. His son Max just came back from Seoul, Korea, doing some esports training things and so forth. And it gives you a chance just to learn a little bit and to connect a little bit. It doesn't take a week, it doesn't take a day, it didn't take an hour, it took what? About 4 to 5 minutes. And all of a sudden what? You're bound together better than you were before because you bothered to ask a question. Hey, Max, how was Korea? And let him talk. And then you listen. All of you in sales know this very well. By the way, the next level up beyond phatic is cathartic. The wheels fall off out there. People need to unload, to cleanse, to dump their bucket, to cathart. I like this picture very much. We live on a teeter-totter. At one end of the teeter-totter is rationality. At the other end of the teeter-totter is emotionality. In the middle is a fulcrum point, let's call it sociability. It's the old teeter-totter like we had when I was a kid at least. Up, down, up, down, up, down. By the way, we're at our best as listeners when we're in balance. Too high rational, not high enough emotional. Too high emotional, not high enough rational. The great listeners that we see are in balance, rational, emotional people. But here's what's interesting. To have, in the listening process, to have productive listeners and productive talkers. We need listeners who understand the importance of catharsis and the ability to listen to other people's problems without judgment, and certainly with heart and with care. And listening at the cathartic level is different from listening at the phatic level. But we listen better at the cathartic level with people that we have listened to at the phatic level, where we're bound together. We don't solve certain things at the phatic level. We don't solve certain things at the cathartic level. But combined, we solve a lot of things. And then, of course, someone could argue that all communication is information-based. And it is. There's information in phatic. There's information in catharsis. There's information in persuasion. But there is some communication that is simply for information. Okay? And as a consequence, the good listeners dig out real carefully. What did you say? What did you mean? And so forth. And then finally, of course, we have persuasion. I said there are 5 purposes of communication. The 5th one is entertainment. I don't talk about that. Now, I'm getting a little signal that my time is coming close, and I am observant. Here's what I want to say. When we take a look at the whole listening process, here's the question. Who's responsible for effective communication? My argument is you are. At a minimum level, 51%. I am at a minimum level, 51%. When I define listening, and you can read it later on, it's right there. It's the complex learned human process of sensing, interpreting, evaluating, storing, and responding to oral messages. And the next 3 or 4 pages, you can read. It's all there. There's a little thing I created. I call it the Steil-Sear model, S-I-E-R. It all starts with sensing. What messages get into your stream of consciousness? How do you deal with all the distractions around you? How do you make sure you hear what people are really saying? You get it into your sensory mechanism. Because what you don't get, guess what? You can't interpret. And what you don't interpret properly, you can't evaluate. And by the way, evaluation, you ought to put an asterisk there because it's only relevant to information and persuasion, not to phatic and cathartic. But eventually, the ultimate outstanding listeners that we see go through this whole process. Social, work, family, wherever it is. And that is, I want to make sure that I really, truly get as much as I can get from what you're sharing with me. I want to make sure that I really understand what you mean from your perspective. And that may mean me simply asking, tell me that again. What does that mean? And so forth. And if I agree, that's one thing. If I disagree, that's another. But the fact of the matter, the great listeners are good evaluators. Is this fact or opinion? Is this well-reasoned? Is this da-da-da-da-da-da? But eventually, the best listeners in the world that we see are the ones who are active, and ultimately, they're responsive. And they're responsive in their behavior. One last thought. When we take a look at the whole activity, there's a thing, identifying and controlling distractions, controlling emotions, and obviously looking at organizational structures. The really skilled listeners have worked like great athletes to make sure that they refine their capabilities along these lines. And they work at it. It doesn't just happen, they work at it. And a consequence, they profit, they benefit, and most important of all the people around them benefit, because the relations, the end results, all of that grows like Topsy. Any questions?
One question I have,
Yep.
it's talking about tragedy. In a previous presentation, you talked about that airplane crash in
Tenerife.
Where the 2 planes.
Yeah.
Could you share that story?
Yeah, the worst disaster in the history of aviation occurred on the ground. Tenerife Islands, a number of years ago. There was the bad weather. The planes were on the ground. The controller said to one pilot, go down the runway exit at 1B, the second off-ramp. The first off-ramp was, by the way, under work, okay? But there was another plane on the other end of the same runway coming this way, focus, sit and stay. And the first pilot thought, well, we're not getting off at 1A, 1B. There was confusion, understanding. You want to talk about understanding? Misinterpretation, etc. We'll never know. They've looked at this exhaustively. The Pan Am pilot at the other end, 747, sitting ready to take off, was basically told, hold, till the other plane is off. And they don't know whether he heard hold until, they might have simply said, take off, take off. Down the runway, full collision, 2 747s on the ground, worst disaster in the history of aviation, and you can track it back probably to ineffective listening, amongst other things. The sinking of the Titanic. You know, there's good evidence nowadays that the message was sent. Somebody didn't listen. You could go over and over and over with these major issues, but the Tenerife, if you want to, and by the way, there have been books written on that if you want to read some fascinating things about 2 people, 2 pilots, hundreds of people killed. Okay, thanks, Don.